So for our final panel, Cultural Migrations, we have 3 speakers. First, we have Aliyah Khan. She's an assistant professor in the departments of English and in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan. Next to her is Karen Jalatian, who's a Manugian postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Comparative Literature. And last but not least, we have Khaled Matawa, associate professor in the Department of English at University of Michigan and a poet. Please join me in welcoming them here. And yes, thank you. And our first speaker is Aliyah Khan, and she will be reading Transatlantic Sufism in Afro-Caribbean Islam. Welcome.
All right, thank you all of you for being here at 4:30 on a Monday. And also, assalamu alaikum. Okay, so my talk is entitled Transatlantic Sufism in Afro-Caribbean Islam. And what I want to start off by saying is that this paper is based on a chapter from my forthcoming book, which, I have to plug because academic presses don't do that, on Caribbean Islam. So the book is entitled Far from Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean. Here is the cover of it. It's on the history, literature, and politics of the Muslim Caribbean. There's a book flyer circulating somewhere on the table over there, too, if you'd like one. It has a coupon discount code, if you wish one, to get this book. So in any case, this will be out from Rutgers University Press in April 2020. All right. Not every Muslim in the South American Caribbean nation of Guyana is a South Asian Indian. In the Caribbean, Islam is often considered to be a religion of the Indo-Caribbean descendants of Indian indentured laborers, but there is a significant history of African Islam in the region. I'll begin this talk by noting the multi-ethnic and multi-religious participation in the 19th century Muslim colonial festival of Taja or Hussein in Guyana and Trinidad. Then I will discuss the Islamic writings of 2 West African men enslaved in Jamaica in the early 1800s, Muhammad Kaba Sagunugu of Ivory Coast and Abu Bakr al-Siddiq of Timbuktu, as well as the Sufi-influenced religious poetry of Abdurrahman Slade Hopkinson in 20th century Guyana. Essentially, I'm interested in establishing a genealogy of Afro-Caribbean Muslim literature, so I'll argue that these men's literary works are linked across a transnational migratory century and a half by a concern with Sufi Muslim ideas of the hidden, batin, and other religious political principles of West African Islam, though Hopkinson is also concerned, the poet is also concerned with questions of how the Guyanese landscape, the hinterlands, differs from that of the island Caribbean. Sufism is, as some of you and certain of you in the audience know already, is the so-called mystical branch of Islam, of the whirling dervishes and the Persian poets Jalaluddin Rumi and Omar Khayyam. In the form of tariqa brotherhoods, Sufism has held strong in West Africa from the 15th century onwards, even when falling out of favor elsewhere. Literary West African Islam reached a height in the 15th and 16th centuries, with 150 to 180 predominantly Sunni Quranic schools in Timbuktu, international engagement with Sunni Egyptian scholars, and travel to the Arabian Hajj. Sufism arrived in Timbuktu from the North African Maghreb in the 15th century. I want to point your attention to this slide here. The most historically visible instantiation and metonym of Caribbean Islam is the Shia Muslim festival of Muharram that became Taja or Tazia in Guyana and Hussein in Trinidad during the 1838 to 1917 period of Indian indentureship following the abolition of slavery in the British West Indies. This festival, which commemorates an early Islamic battle and martyrdom central to the religious division between Sunni and Shia Islam, was also celebrated in Jamaica and Suriname. Its equivalent is called Yamse in Mauritius, which also received Indian indentured laborers. Taja, or Hussein, was a multi-day religious celebration featuring a public procession of large and small model tombs. You can see them in the background here. Those are called tajas. A red model of the crescent moon and a green model of the moon, representing the brothers Hussein and Hassan, respectively, as well as flags, singing, dancing, and drumming. In the earlier indentureship days of the festival, there was also stick fighting, known as gatakar, and fire dancing. The Taja model tombs that you see here are carried toward a mythic extranational Karbala, the Iraqi city where Hussein was martyred in an early Islamic battle. The Tajas are then usually taken to the sea, into the sea to be submerged, a gesture sometimes criticized in Trinidad and Guyana as too Hindu. Taja, or Hussein, has Shia Muslim roots and is usually associated with Indians in the Caribbean, South Asian Indians in the Caribbean. But the illustrative point I want to begin with here is that in the colonial period, the festival attracted both Muslim and Hindu Indians, as well as African celebrants and participants, and that is partly why the British colonial government feared it and attempted to stamp it out. In 19th century Trinidad, Afro-Trinidadians found Jose's carnival-esque street festival aspect familiar and began to take part in the procession as drummers for which they were paid in rum or cash. I should say first that demographically, the populations of Trinidad and Guyana are about evenly split between the descendants of Indian indentured laborers and the descendants of enslaved Africans, essentially people who were brought by the British to work on sugar plantations during the colonial period. In any case, to reiterate what I just said, in 19th century Trinidad, Afro-Trinidadians began participating in what was a South Asian Indian Muslim festival as drummers. They sometimes carried the tajas, the model tombs. The working class Afro-Caribbean transition from partygoer to participant was even more pronounced in British Guyana, where Afro-Guyanese also began as festival porters and drummers, but then started up their own parallel Good Friday festival of Black Taja. This festival, this Shia Muslim festival, Taja, was suppressed in British Guyana in 1869 with Colonial Ordinance Number 16, which stipulated that no Taja processions will be permitted to enter the precincts either of the city of Georgetown, the capital, or of the town of New Amsterdam, the second largest town in the country. This ordinance imposed a host of other restrictions on pain of imprisonment and hard labor. In Trinidad, in an 1884 event that came to be known as the Muharram massacre, police read the riot act to Jose processions entering the town of San Fernando in defiance of Trinidad's similar 1882 government ordinance. The colonial police in Trinidad then opened fire in 1882 on the defiant but unarmed crowd, killing 16 and wounding scores more. These killings, not Trinidad's 1882 ordinance, which was less restrictive than British Guyana's, were what signaled the decline of the festival and Afro-Trinidadian participation in it in Trinidad. What remained of the Muslim festival of Hussein in early 20th century Trinidad and Guyana after colonial restrictions and the uncompromising hostility directed toward it by Presbyterian missionaries then fell out of favor with mainstream Sunni Muslims who looked down on the festival's Shia origins and down on its irreligious festive atmosphere, as well as the alleged idolatry of Taziadari, the model tomb procession. The festival survived in St. James and Cedros in Trinidad and has undergone an interethnic 20th century revival there. At its colonial height, Taja or Hussein was an intriguingly flexible arena for interracial and interreligious participation, providing a Muslim avenue for cultural exchange between Black and Indian residents of Trinidad and Guyana, who were usually pitted against each other in the colonial labor economy. I begin with this point to show that the equating of race with religion in the Caribbean is partly a product of British colonial attempts to suppress creolization and religious syncretism, not a relationality that should be framed as always natural. In the rest of the paper, I'll focus on the transatlantic migratory Afro-Caribbean Islam, on, as I mentioned, the autobiographical religious texts of two enslaved West Africans in Jamaica, and on the Guyanese poetry of Abdurrahman, Slade, Hopkinson. As noted, my interest is in establishing a lineage of Afro-Caribbean Muslim literature, partly in service of disproving the notion that Afro-Caribbean Islam simply begins with conversion in the 20th century. Here's a Hajj ad from 1969 in the Caribbean. In any case, in 1970, the number of Muslims in Guyana peaked at 9% and in Trinidad at 6.26% of the population. These numbers have decreased as a result of migration to England and to North America. In the early 2000s, Muslims were 13.5% of people from Suriname. That includes both Javanese and Indian Muslims, and they were a statistically negligible 0.04% of Jamaicans. Historians Michael Gomez and Edward Curtis suggested there may have been tens of thousands, or 10%, of enslaved Africans in the Americas, that includes North America, who were Muslim. As difficult as it is to estimate the overall numbers of Africans who embarked upon slave ships and did or did not survive the Middle Passage, it is even more impossible to know how many enslaved Africans might have been Muslim. What we do know, however, is that though a continental religious minority, there were Muslims of many ethnicities and tribal affiliations in the West African, Senegambian, and Guinean slave trading regions. This is where the majority of enslaved people came from. There were a number of literate Muslim Africans who wrote autobiographies that were known to their contemporaries in the United States. There are far fewer such texts in the Caribbean. One is from 1817 Trinidad by Muhammadu Aishatu, a Hausa, an imam from Gobir in what is now Nigeria. He was a soldier in the 3rd West Indian Regiment, which consisted of African men who, after 1808, had been pulled off of slave ships and freed if they agreed to fight for the British in the Napoleonic Wars. David Trotman and Paul Lovejoy write that a significant minority of the soldiers in those African regiments were Muslims, partly as many may have come from ships traveling from the heavily Muslim Bight of Benin in the Gulf of Guinea. Another thing to note here is by dint of their literacy and educations, some enslaved Muslim Africans were treated better on plantations in both the Caribbean and in North America, and were given positions like driver or bookkeeper more often than non-literate and non-Muslim Africans. In Jamaica, our first author, Muhammad Kaba Sagunugu, alias Dick, alias Robert Pert, alias Robert Tuffet, alias Muhammad Kaba, alias the Mohammedan, a native of Buka in northern Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, arrived in Jamaica, enslaved in 1777 at the age of about 21. He died in 1845, still in bondage in Jamaica. Kaba wrote an Arabic autobiographical and theological treatise around 1820. This manuscript is untitled, but his translators, Paul Lovejoy and Yassine Adoun, have dubbed it the Kitab al-Salat, or the Book on Praying. This is the first 2 pages, of course, read from right to left here. His name was Muhammad Kaba Sagunugu. The patronymic Kaba suggests that he was likely a Senegambian Mande or Mandinka of the Jakanke merchant and clerical diaspora. His immediate clan, the Sagunugu, were an important clerical family, noted for teaching the Islamic sciences and associated with the tradition of Sufi scholarship founded by the Sheikh Salim al-Suwari in the late 15th century. Ivor Wilkes and other historians describe the Sufi Muslim West African Suwarian tradition as a branch of the larger Qadiriya Sufi brotherhood that had a learned, pacifist, and quietist orientation. After the 17th century decline of the Muslim-led Mali Empire, Kaba's people, the Suwari, embraced an ideology of pluralism, coexistence, and assimilation for Muslims living in non-Muslim lands. There is no way of knowing whether Kaba's understanding of his accommodationist natal Islamic tradition allowed him to convert to Christianity in Jamaica. He was in fact baptized as a Moravian in 1813, but the interesting thing is that he wrote his Islamic kitab after that. Kaba also reported mystic prophesying dreams, a Sufi phenomenon that drove his Christian conversion. Perhaps he then felt that Allah endorsed his taqiyya, his prudence, which is an Islamic theological and jurisprudential concept permitting hiding one's religion if there is a threat to one's life. In considering, and this concept has been taken up by right-wing Islamophobes in the United States in a really, I want to say interesting, but a really disturbing way, right, in which they use it to argue that Muslims constitute a fifth column in the United States. In considering Kaba's conversion to Christianity and theorizing his possible continued adherence to Islam, I emphasize first that the Kitab, which is essentially an autobiographical manual on practicing Islam, was written at least 7 years after his Christian baptism. Second, that he was a Swahili Kadiri West African Muslim from a tradition revolving around accommodation in a non-Muslim society. And third, his own words suggest that he was grieved by the material and religious circumstances in which he found himself. A brief word on this, it's really difficult to translate this because it's not necessarily just written in Arabic. It's written in Ajami, right, which is it's like a general name given for transliterations of West African languages into Arabic script. And it could be any combination of them. Oftentimes it's like a combination of Arabic and Hausa and like any number of things. Hard to translate. But you can probably tell that it begins with the basmala, right, like Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Kaba addresses his manuscript in the beginning to the Jamaatul Muslimina wal Muslimat. Where is that? It's like here. Yeah. Third and second to last lines. That is, he called on the Muslim community while speaking as one of them, even though this is years after his Christian baptism. He concludes part 1 of his autobiography with a wrenching sentiment. He says, "The book is finished. The last day of writing by the hands of the Abd is Friday. The Jews refer to the name of the one who owns the writing as Muhammad Kaba Sagunugu. I am Muhammad Kaba Sagunugu. I do not know anything of the knowledge of Al-Bahr. My memory is corrupted. I am not finding science. I have started asking for pardon day and night. I ask for pardon for every situation." And I want you to envision the fact that this man is writing this while enslaved in Jamaica. Abd is usually translated as slave, including in the sense of Islamic submission to Allah. It is also a racist anti-black slur in the Arabic-speaking world. Kaba implies that he is a slave within, by choice to Allah, and without, by force, to whites in Jamaica. Al-Bahr also has a double meaning. It literally means sea, but refers specifically to any man of science or one who displays a wide range of knowledge. When Kaba says that he does not know anything of the knowledge of Al-Bahr, it is not because he never did, but because after decades of enslavement, as he says, his memory is corrupted and he is not finding science. His knowledge of his Sufi West African birthright has become fragmented, but he nonetheless attempts to set it on paper for posterity. Of whom is he asking for pardon day and night? Elsewhere in this autobiography, he mentions his Islamic teachers by name. He is also perhaps asking their pardon for his forgetting of religious knowledge and for his conversion, but his lament also carries the sense of asking God for both answer and forgiveness for the hardships of his enslaved existence. At the time of this writing, Kaba is already an old man, thinking of and welcoming death. He is a Moravian, but he's still a Muslim, in essence. And the argument that I make in this book, because some people have judged him very harshly, some historians have judged him very harshly for his conversion, but I will contend that he can't be judged for his conversion by any Islamic religious standard that does not allow for the horror of chattel slavery. I mean, he did far more to preserve his Islamic heritage than most people could or did. Kaba corresponded by letter with another enslaved Jamaican Muslim in whom Magistrate R.R. Madden, an abolitionist Irish magistrate in Jamaica with a fascination for Muslim Africans, took a great interest and whose freedom he helped secure. This enslaved Muslim was named Abu Bakr al-Siddiq, alias Edward Donnellan. He was originally from Timbuktu, Mali. Magistrate Madden recorded Kaba's and Abu Bakr's letters to each other, claiming that both men's conversions to Christianity or desires to convert to Christianity were suspect. I'm quoting Magistrate Madden here. Kaba writes a letter in Arabic to Donnellan and states that the purport of the letter is to convert Donnellan from Mohammedanism to the Christian faith, unquote. Madden, no fool, then exclaims, "But what is my surprise at finding the letter of the old man who is so anxious to convert his countrymen from the Mussulman creed, commencing in these terms, in the name of God, merciful and omnipotent, the blessing of God, the peace of his prophet Muhammad." So much for the old African's renunciation of Islam. Madden correctly identified there the basmala, right? Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim, which we just saw, which begins each surah or chapter of the Quran. In the same letters, Abu Bakr asked to be sent a copy of the Quran, even though he claimed to be interested in Christian conversion. Abu Bakr eventually also wrote his own brief autobiography and returned to Africa a free man. Jumping to the present period, with no transition really at all, Abdurrahman Slade Hopkinson born in 1934 in New Amsterdam, British Guyana, was a Caribbean poet of the Brathwaite-Walcott independence and post-colonial generation, a Muslim convert, and the father of award-winning speculative fiction writer Nalo Hopkinson. But his work is far less well-known and studied than that of most of his contemporaries. For a number of reasons, including that he didn't really like publishing his poems, and he also suffered from serious kidney disease for the last decades of his life, and he hailed from the unique South American post-colonial space of Guyana, which has received less recognition in the Anglophone Caribbean than island poets. The volume Snowscape with Signature collects many of his poems from 1952 to 1992, it's in the corner there, and was published in 1993 shortly after his death. The religious poems in this text include things like Ahad, Zikr, Soul, Neither Fog Nor Flight, and Azan, and they invoke medieval Sufi mystics and teachers from the medieval era to the 18th century. I do a bunch of close readings of those poems in the book, and I'd be happy to talk to you about them afterwards. But one thing I want to end with here is that Caribbean literary critics do not usually know what to do with Hopkinson's religious poetry because it engages with a religious current that is Islam, that seems foreign to the Caribbean and its majority Christian and African syncretic religion, so that, analysis is deferred. And what I do here is establish a Sufi linkage, right? His poetry is very much rooted in the poetry of like Omar Khayyam, again, and Jalaluddin Rumi and so on. And I establish a literary lineage between his work and the work of these enslaved men that I spoke of before. So I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aliyah. Next we have Karin on the singularities of diasporic becoming through and beyond our amenities. Thank you.
Okay. Hello. In 1931, in a Western Armenian volume of poetry published in Paris by the poet Nigar Sarafian, let me see if this works. One finds the following lines. Naked here I am before the sea, giving birth to us, my chest wide against the winds in the cold, giant, ever-changing green. Delight, salutation to my inner contradiction, salutation to the great inundating flux, salutation to the sea which anointed this new birth of mine. And in Armenian, Mergaha yes mesenoch zovunarchev kurskers line hoveruntem bachaska ganachin mech harapoch herjvank. Ողջուն իմ ներքին հագասանքիս, ողջուն մեծ մագնտացման ողողող, ողջուն ծովում, որ նոր վերածնումս օձեց. Nigar Sarafian was born in Bulgaria in 1902. The story goes that he was actually born on a ship on the Black Sea, grew up in Constantinople, Istanbul, the center of the Western Armenian cultural life, and settled in Paris after escaping the Armenian catastrophe, the genocide. Western Armenian is a literary language that draws from classical and medieval literary vernacular Armenian, including its alphabet, to fully formed by the second half of the 19th century. After the 1915 catastrophe, Western Armenian is a stateless language spoken in communities in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, France, Canada, United States, Argentina, Australia, to name the main centers. The vast majority of its dwindling numbers of speakers are far away from the areas in Central and Eastern Anatolia where Armenians historically lived. The Turkish state to this day denies this genocide and has barred Armenians' entry. Titled Reflux and Flux, Տեղադրություն եւ Անգընթացություն, and written between 1931 and 1938 in Paris, Sarafian's volume of poetry was published in 1939. It opens with two long-form poems in lyrical form, titled Reflux and Flux, respectively, and is followed by 42 shorter poems. The excerpt that I read comes from the second part. Part one begins with the poet stating that in a state of exile, there are no more ideals and dreams left for him. He explicitly mentions fatherland and mother tongue as among the discarded myths sunk in the sea of his despair. Yet, walking that seabed, the poet claims to be in a realm of survival with its, quote, secret and waving liveliness, end of quote. The recurrence of the poet's despair is conveyed by the undulating form of the work. Flux continues the undulating movement begun with reflux, both at the level of verse and stanza, while also reproducing with modification key tropes from reflux. This binds the two poems together, while at the same time giving each its freedom of movement. Sarafian's poetic meditations on survival in exile result into a profound love contradiction, the poet's inner contradiction. Birth and death, formation and destruction of individual, collective, national identity, the other and the self are part of the same underlying and undulating motion. Sarafian's reliance on nautical motifs functions on formal, literal, and metaphoric levels. His formulation of a law of innermost contradiction of life at a time when anti-colonial movements are largely adopting the European model, the European nation-state model, constitutes one of the most compelling moments of a singular inscription of diasporic becoming. In 1963, the most provocative and prolific diaspora Armenian poet writing in Western Armenian, Vahel Shagan, published in Beirut a volume of poetry titled Karak, or City. In it, Oshagan writes, "Along the banks of Mother Arax, the fatherland stretches up to the borders of the dress." In Armenian, Ma Araxi aperov, hayrenike getarazvi minchev sahmanneres gestin. Here, along the banks of Mother Arax, is a line from an Armenian patriotic poem, The Tears of Arax, by Rafael Patkanyan, a poet of the second half of the 19th century. Arax is a river that marks the southeastern border of Armenia. Patkanyan's emotionally charged poem anthropomorphizes Arax by having her speak of the country's erstwhile greatness in contrast to its current dismal state. Vahel Shagan was born in 1922 in a family of the great Western Armenian writer Hagop Oshagan, who was born in 1883 and passed away in 1948. In his teens, Oshagan moved with his family to Jerusalem and Cyprus. He studied in Paris from 1946 to 52, eventually completing a doctoral degree in comparative literature at the Sorbonne. Settling in Beirut, Lebanon in the early 1960s, he immersed himself in writing, publishing, and teaching Armenian literature. At the outbreak of the Lebanese Civil War in 1975, Oshagan moved to the US, living in Philadelphia and San Francisco, and continuing to publish poetry, prose, and literary criticism. He also resided in Killara, Australia, not far from Sydney, before returning to Philadelphia, where he passed away in 2000. The opening section of the volume City, titled Entry, gives a panoramic view of a city under the morning light. The city is described paradoxically as a place where human beings are barred from encountering each other, which makes their existence absurd. Through figures such as the prison guard, the porter, the judge, the smuggler, the prostitute, the teacher, and the doctor, the poem describes absurd states of human existence. The different sections of the volume elaborate on the sites where humans lead their absurd existence. These sites are the mind, cinema, cabaret, room, and church. What is more, as a place of inauthenticity, the city looks for at least a single witness to it, which it cannot find. Oshagan's poetry is meant to carry out this act of witnessing. At the end of the opening section of the City, Oshagan writes, and I'm reading, I guess, from here. "The city that gathers thousands of people, but does not equal to one man's, one room's, one unpostponable and erroneous yearning. Քաղաքը, որ հազարավոր մարդիկ գուդագե, բայց չավաս արեցներ մեկ մարդու, մեկ սենյակի, մեկ անհետացկելի ու վրիբաց տենչի." Accordingly, city does not simply describe the distractions from the meaninglessness of life that constitutes the city, but also the yearning for meaning. The full title of the volume is City, an Epic, Volume 1, Karak 2002 Mahadur Aip. Among other senses, the word which I am translating as epic alludes to the medieval Armenian epic, the Daredevils of Sassoon, dating from the 8th century. It recounts the successful Armenian rebellion against the domination of the Islamic Empire. Unlike the Daredevils of Sassoon, written down in the 19th century and giving impetus to the formation of modern Armenian national consciousness, Oshagan's epic hardly falls within a national logic. The provocatively ironic and intertextual line along the banks of Mother Arax, the fatherland stretches up to the borders of the dress, implies that in the consciousness of a survival of a national catastrophe, the longing for a national homeland still lingers. This way, Oshagan inaugurates diaspora as post-national and post-catastrophic. Grigor Beledian is a Beirut-born, Paris-based Western Armenian writer who has been publishing poetry since the 1960s. From equally early on, he has been writing critical essays on poetry, offering readings of virtually every major and some lesser-known Western Armenian poets. In 2010, Beledian published his substantial volume of poetry, Mantras, which begins with an essay titled Rhythmic Cut, Gsharagan Hadum. In it, Beledian writes, "Now what need is there to write poetry with more or less beautiful language, prose verse, to strike words to each other, to make images gush, to polish ideas, to showcase an eye that one does not have, to become intemperate, to adapt mythology and patrimonial myth, to put into work poetic enchantment, sublimity of emotion, imaginative power, in one word, to enter into the game of expression. Writing poetry seems so seriously ridiculous that you ignore the creative act. You ironize, you do not believe in its erstwhile force. But since you do not want thought to abandon you, you do not want to abandon the self that you are not anymore, to become thoughtless, you hand yourself over to the contrary. Distraction is ceremony. You unmask the illusion, you oppose the aim, you work against it, you confront. Language turns over itself. With a somewhat quick and sovereign determination, you turn poetry into anti-poetry, you lean on it, like a guard pondering the beloved dead. The disenchantment has already begun, you are not a poet." In a passage above, the word ararogutsun, which is above here, this word, ceremony, is not chosen accidentally. Its primary denotation is ceremony rite, particularly in a theological, holy, sacred sense. Yet the root arar is the basis for the verb ararel or the noun arats, meaning to create and creature respectively, also bearing Christian theological connotations. Thus, in the above passage, it makes more sense to translate the sentence with the word ararutsun as destruction is ceremony, or the other way around, destruction is creative ceremony, or destruction is ceremonial creation. Either way, here we have come across a figure of post-catastrophe, since at stake is inscribing survival after destruction. Immediately after the paragraph that I cited, there is an implicit yet hard to miss reference to the philosopher Martin Heidegger in the form of a question. And I'm quoting here. There we go, I should wait. "But who does not want to rest, to find solid ground, stable land measure, to enjoy existence, to dwell, to simply dwell in language, as one great master used to say of the deeply rooted nest and dwelling?" End of quote. That Beledian is entering into dialogue with Heidegger is not surprising, given the fact that Beledian wrote his first doctoral thesis on the aesthetic in Heidegger's thought. In his letter on Humanism, 1949, Heidegger, starting with the very first paragraph, makes his now famous claim, quote, "Language is the house of being," end of quote. His overall argument, Heidegger's, is that humanism is part of the metaphysical tradition, which for centuries, from Plato to Aristotle, the Romans, the Christians, Hegel, Marx, and even Nietzsche, has not been able to properly pose the question of being, busying itself instead with thinking beings in plural. Heidegger writes, "Metaphysics closes itself to the simple essential fact that the human being essentially occurs in his essence only where he is claimed by being. Only from that claim has he found that wherein his essence dwells. Only from this dwelling does he have language as the home that preserves the ecstatic for his essence. Such standing in the clearing of being I call the existence of human beings," end of quote. After his tacit, not so tacit allusion to Heidegger, Beledian continues thus, "Only whoever has house, the one who stays on the side of the living, becomes the guard of the language. But the homeless, the inheritor of the lifeless, is banished so far away that she has neither the essence anymore, nor is capable of being near it," end of quote. And so accordingly, the point that Heidegger is trying to make is that the dying of Western Armenian language points to an experience of homelessness that Heidegger's thought of language as the house of being and metaphysics as its homelessness cannot adequately think. This homelessness is radical because it is language itself, the house of being, that is dying. Beledian then asks the following questions. But what form for the lacking language? Later he poses a more precise question. Is not rhythm form in space? Indeed, what form does the description of the dying of a language take? Or rather, how are inherent poetic forms deformed due to this experience? To think this problematic, Beledian turns to ancient Indian mantras, which he describes thus. Forms of speech filled with the erstwhile force of speech, linked with universal divine force, and as such, thanks to repetition, they lead the applier to the supreme speech. They are a means of knowing on the contemplative and practical level, but also beyond the mind, intramental and condensed entities. They have a commonality with linguistic application, except that the poetic forms rarely lead to merely sound combinations. In its supreme and most sublime sense, in the Vedic tradition, mantra is determined as a local form of divinity. End of quote. Mantras, as Beledian takes them, exceed the Western metaphysical categories of subjectivity, including the poetic category of the lyrical, and are not governed by the logic of expression. Instead, they are means through which supreme speech, to quote Beledian, a state of consciousness beyond subjectivity is reached. He adds, the universe is born from voice, as the one is the only sonorous vibration that the essence, non-essence sounded. The whole is sound construction, spiritual matter, image of dance, rhythm. The hearer, the writer, can infinitely construct the silence. I interpret it, I choose, I metaphor. End of quote. The longer sentence before the parenthetical deploys figurative language by juxtaposing antithetical qualities. Quote, to quote again, sound construction, spiritual matter, image of dance, rhythm. End of quote. This mode of figuration gives an idea of the mantra, gives an idea of how the mantra disrupt ordinary mental linguistic categories. How, to quote again Beledian, thought is suspended by figuration. After these very brief excursus and acknowledging the unfairness of skipping 31 mantras, overall some 600 pages, written across 3 decades, let us read the last one entitled People-Less Language. I choose this mantra also because, as this title suggests, it explicitly addresses the problematic of post-catastrophic language. This mantra has 13 numbered fragments. Here is fragment 10. To you every word they lent, oh, these guarding absent ones of every speech, for you to return to them with the play of your voice. Separate the exact obscurity from darkness, the breath from murmur, keep fever and panting, keep whatever shivers, the vibrating, that which is most filled with life, the miracle of light in trees' fervor. Caress the dewdrop after the suffocating nights, forget star and moon and forest, mirages, forget every comparison. Exempt from salt and tear, with brightness become absent, O guard of loss. If words are not life-giving, improbably fragile, they will forever disappear. Those who one by one lent them to you with their present rich denial. The beginning of this fragment suggests that the language, every word of the text, is borrowed from the unburied dead of the Armenian catastrophe, they, to whom he needs to return them, or it, language. What form could such a return take, which the text immediately characterizes as the play of your voice? An answer is provided soon after when the text formulates the ordinance to become absent, to clear space for the haunting silences to come to the fore. Otherwise, in an age of denial, when the ghostly presence of the unburied dead and the untellable experience of their catastrophe are constantly erased, the ghosts once again will be erased. 3 singular moments of diasporic becoming. As you may have already noticed, they have something in common. They are all figures of negativity. There are moments that inscribe the breaking down of hegemonic categories of meaning and identity. These moments register the paralysis of the discursive, political, cultural, and material realities that have led to the production of the so-called migrants. Singular instances of the negative is not to be understood as the opposite of the positive, but as that which exposes that very binary. We should be vigilant to not fall into the trap of thinking negativity as positively given. Migrants in general, not just diaspora Armenians, I dare to say, individuals and collectivities experience and inscribe this kind of negativity. They are its carriers and potential exposers, whether or not there is an inherited standard literary language that serves as a substrate for it. Diasporic becoming. Not a nation, not a people, not a monolingually conceived language, but a potential of emergence that forms at the margins of hegemonies while also offering them a legibility. Its singular moments, some of which I have tried to approach, describe, and share with you today, call for interdisciplinary, intersectional, multilingual, open-ended, nuanced, radical forms of reading. Migration, displacement, uprooting demand this kind of negative legibility. And as we saw with each of these poets, there is something liberating to riding the waves of the negative, to registering, to inscribing it in art, assuming that one survives the violence that leads to the negative. How to historicize survival as negativity? Historization, conventionally speaking, being the discourse that revolves around the positive, around verifiable facts, documents, as well as positively conceived intentionality of choice, for example, of choosing to migrate and then being asked to go back. The instances of the negative that we saw are singular in the sense that they uniquely make and unmake sense within their specific contexts. The three poets that I mentioned engage with the thought around them, in this case, interwar, post-war, and post-structuralist French thought, but are not passively influenced by them. Negatively reading their works, both in and out of context, is a creative act of historicizing diasporic becoming. The archive of catastrophe, almost by definition, is missing. The recent call for critical fabulation by Saidi Hartman in Venice into Acts, 2008, in the face of the murderous absences of hallowing the legible and illegible textual and material remains of transatlantic slavery, is one of the most compelling responses to this. In the wake of such approaches, I propose diasporic becoming as yet another form of the afterlife of the lack of archive, including when this lack of archive is violently and paranoidly exploited by perpetrators and repressed by survivors. When writers like Sarafian, Oshagan, and Bouledian attempt to expose this lack, as well as when different diasporas encounter other cultures, and especially other diasporas, and think their condition in and through the other's absences, as it is happening with this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karin. And last but not least, we have Khaled. He's going to be reading from his chapbook of poems, Mare Nostrum. See? Yeah.
I don't have an image, but they have an image that could play here. So I will rely on voice. Yeah? It's this same image, but it's too small from here. So, and it'll be flat when I read, so you won't be able to see it. Where do I put the water? There's no place for the water. Yes. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I'll begin. I'll be reading poems from a chapbook called Mare Nostrum, and Mare Nostrum is the Latin word for our sea, the Latin name for our sea. It's what the Romans called the Mediterranean. And so there's a renaming, but more specifically, Mare Nostrum was an operation by the Italian Navy in 2013 to basically stop the migration flow coming from, mainly from Libya. The migration from the Mediterranean, or at least from West Africa and from other parts of Africa. There were I don't have a map either. People were coming from East Africa, going up Sudan and Egypt and try to cross Sinai into Israel, and there are several people who made that way. And the other, perhaps the biggest flow was from West Africa. People had taken boats and gotten into the Spanish islands in the Atlantic. The biggest occurrence was actually a time when Senegalese fishermen were unable to fish anymore in their waters and basically got on their boats and kept going until they hit Spanish islands. And before that, people had gone up all the way to Morocco and and tried to either cross the Gibraltar Straits to Spain or to try to get into the Ceuta and Melilla in Morocco, which are North Africa, which are Spanish territories. And in 2011, by 2010, 2011, the Spanish had actually brought their Guardia Civil all the way into West Africa. Basically, you could be in a small town somewhere in Mali or in Ouagadougou or elsewhere, and you could find a Spanish police force inside the local police stations. They were available on the borders between Senegal and Mauritania. They were all over the place. And so people were trying to go through Algeria to try to make it into Morocco and up that way. But when the Gaddafi regime fell, I mean, there had been flows coming out of Libya anyway that Gaddafi had tried to exploit. At one time, when during some negotiations with the Italian government, he'd said he would he would flood Europe with a sea of blacks. But the time his regime fell and the security apparatus that he had in line, and by that time the western flow had been closed, pretty much with the Spanish. And of course, Frontex had been established, so any boat that basically leaves West Africa is being overseen by a set of computers in Warsaw, Poland. The open territory, the open territory place was Libya. So everything that was coming, that was supposed to go from all over Africa was coming through Libya, and either from Eritrea, Ethiopia, elsewhere, and then through the Sudan, or all the way from Senegal to Niger and up to Libya. There had been, where this migration, who's running this migration patterns, who's benefiting from it. 2-3 years ago, a Maltese journalist was murdered because she was looking into how Ukrainian businessmen were involved in gasoline smuggled from Libya, where that gasoline had become legalized through Maltese enterprises. So, and this is without the Nigerian linkages, without the chains of Nigerian young women going up sort of on an express way through Libya all the way to work as prostitutes in Italy. So it is a mess and dangerous and frightening. And of course, I'd followed this. I'd written about it in a previous book with not much knowledge. But what really got me sort of involved more in this is realizing that this hadn't been a big part of the story, because Africans used to come and stay in Libya without much of a. What had developed was that the Libyans got into the business, whereby they became kidnappers. It's not like you get on a car or a 4x4 or something and you're like 20 people in an SUV and you're just going to go through Libya. There will be other SUVs like sharks in the desert. They will intercept you. You had already paid $3,000 to make it to Tripoli, or $1,000 there. Other SUVs will intercept you, pirate you, and force you to pay again. But where will they put you in the meantime? That's when the Libyan network began, and so the Libyans became involved in this business. and they were violent, like many other parts of like this, the emergent kidnappings that are happening to the Central Americans going through Mexico. The flow was sort of opened once the Americans blocked it. People were being kidnapped at every bus station in Mexico now. If you wait there for long enough, somebody could come up with you, knowing that you're from Honduras or from Guatemala or wherever, come up to you with a gun and kidnap you and ask you to pay money. So that's what had happened. So every facet of it had become ugly and violent. And so when people get on the boats from the western side of Libya, they are desperate and very likely in debt. So I'm glad we talked about poetry as being a loss of self, a loss of not knowing who the self is. One of the inspirations was also Fernando Pessoa, the great Portuguese poet who wrote under heteronyms, who wrote a few poems under his name, but all the other poems were through various voices. So this is a book of voices that are selves in the making. Psalm for Departure. And I want to know what time it is. May I have my phone? Not overburden you with poetry. Psalm for Departure. Locusts wrap the sun in gauze. The river swallows its banks. No pleasure but seeing the no king crop here, the no fields, a petrified forest where twins were slain. Someone will follow a bird. The work of fire never ends. Jinn built cities of mirage. The poor stand waiting by the shore. Signs made of stardust and spider thread. Any way you measure it, the difference will be a road. Season of migration to the northwest. The title alludes to an Tayyib Salah novel. Spent years gathering eucalyptus leaves from King Menelik's forests. Their fire makes the best injera, I am told. You climb, wheezing, choking on Addis air. Then you find yourself in these scented woods, back-breaking, but I love bundling the leaves, how the rain soaks the scent into your clothes and skin. Maybe that's why Menelik built his palace here, a great church looming over it to show how content he was. But even he was tempted away. His queen sent a messenger from the foot of Intoto, saying she's found a new Addis, a flower, an Ababa, and he followed her like Adam out of paradise to co-found the metropolis nightmare. Was my dream more than enough air to live on, something between banal sin and the Creator's potency? Addis to the source of the Nile, then Khartoum to Sinai, to be an asylee in Tel Aviv, or northwest through Darfur and Sabha to the Bride of the Med. Names like shabby trees on a map, lines for a screen where bodies are stick figures dancing to tepid applause. Each a degree in a circle, inside a void, unmarked time, days like scentless leaves that slip through your hands. Agadez is the town in Niger that's sort of become the focal point. That's the main point of entry to Libya. A lot of people barely have enough money to come to Agadez, and from there they wait for months. And then from Agadez They try to cross the desert up to the Mediterranean. Psalm on the road to Agadez. Day and night travel to reach these shores, west to north, east to north, north to north to north to north. Your country, your savage country, where you are free. Psalm under siege. I also try to address the migration coming from the Eastern Mediterranean. People are coming from Iran, Afghanistan, Syria. And I've gone to sort of document that, at least for myself, in the Greek islands and Turkey. Psalm under siege. Speak the body's thrift, the blood and breath sustained by a candle flame. Remembrances encircle like moth. No seagulls when fishermen return empty-handed to Arwad. Locusts ravage Idlib fields, the dry wells of Dara, candle light or soul. What else to call what remains alive in me now? How it shrinks like irises blinded by death's blazing noon. Constance song. Constance and Blessing are a pair of young women in this little book. Constance song. Wave, checkpoint, and dune, the roads we tread. Each day, a ragged plastic cup, and people who forget how to die, the way loss befriends lament to a fog heavy with wings. Far away, somewhere, I have a brother or a sister in this world. My blessing hums. Agadez Blues. No place, no money for the bed. Je dors dans la rue, paid only the way. Even God can't see me here. Police take your money. Quand tu n'as pas d'argent, even God can't hear me here. Elle te palpa tout le corps pour vérifier. Palpa all your body. Even God can't save me here. I pay 1,300 francs go to Libye. Mais le chauffeur, il est parti. Even God can't help me here. Je n'ai plus rien pour manger. Je n'ai plus rien pour dormir. Even God can't find me here. Psalm for crossing Nimruz. Nimruz is an area in Pakistan, Afghanistan, another way station. What is a mere grazer to the world of the many and contending, to the jealous one of this earth drying grass? What to them, what to time and limb spent this far, the wind voracious, its mind aflame? Psalm under siege. Speak the jet fighter's contrails, speak the rumble of my pulse, its screech and roar of barrel bombs, a cesspool of sewer overflow, and a broken water main, a gleaming lake haunting your thirst. Reeds shoot up of its shores, swallows hop in between, chirping when the shellings pause. Malouk's Ode. Malouk is a character in the novel African Titanics by the Eritrean novelist Abu Bakr Kahal. Abu Bakr Kahal was living in Libya when he wrote his book. He wrote it in Arabic and actually got published in Libya. Malouk's Ode. I tap a few words to her on WhatsApp or Viber to blot out the day. I bring my nose close to the screen to smell the photos she sends. Selfies of her by the stove or the baby making a gesture, a smile or a yawn or a cry. Sometimes a video of an old song. She asks about the sea. It's calm, but the traffickers no show. She breaks me, a softness that turns me dusk. I, the poet dissident, who labor to rephrase with healing the nation's inflamed contract, who rove the bone sculptures made government, the sanctuaries filled fear bright eyes, my words now monosyllabic, soft as sighs. There was blindness in my game, my epic of home. I hear the smugglers, their pupils shifting, as if following a maddened gull. Some bootleg spasm and discharge, a blindness that cannot stop seeing. Those eyes will keep shifting like this in their graves. I see my spirit too, a plastic cloud drifting in the breeze. With them is our last chance for what? From the village dying up to sand, the town without jobs, the hands that never learn to write, that eyes that barely read, the soul hunger, stump and trade. Am I writing my poem again? Have I become the exile I so mock and detest? How to walk this sea, how to not believe that such is possible, arrived in Kufra, the cramped 4x4s, the hylocks where spent bodies cling to wooden poles, Evecos, 100-packed swaying death's wave, emptied in the camp, divided between sheets of galvanize, the courtyard littered, bottles close old photographs, like some carnival bacchanal the night before, a town facing massacre just fled, an empty once crowded barracoon where the signal is one ribbon strong. It is from here that I send her my love. Into the sea. Barely out of the jetty, the boat rises with every wave, and in the back, 2 or 3 fall into the sea. At sunset, the boat starts to lose air, fills with water. Mothers and babies fall into the sea. One side stays afloat. We cling to a rope, water up to our belly, and people fall into the sea. All night we grip and bleed. Rain so cold, waves 5 stories high. If only I could fall into the sea. Sunrise, a helicopter, I find a red shirt, wave it to them, they watch us fall into the sea. They fling a small inflatable boat, I am too weak to reach it, others try and fall into the sea. A cargo boat throws a rope, get us on board, alive at last, and we still fall into the sea. I'm ignoring you, Rima. Fuel burns. This is from a blog entry by Dr. Sarah Giles. She's a Canadian physician who volunteered with Doctors Without Borders. Fuel burns. Gasoline canisters leak or get knocked over. Gasoline mixes with seawater, and when the mixture touches human skin, skin begins to burn. Women sitting in the bottom or the center of the boat are at highest risk. Dinghies are fitted with plywood floors, fixed with nails and screws that puncture people's feet. The wood soaks up water, expands and then splits. Women and children often fall through the floor or are trampled and drowned. People fight on the boat. The bodies of survivors and the dead are full of scratches, bite marks, cuts and bruises. But it's fuel burns that horrify most. Survivors arrive, hypothermic, dehydrated, barely conscious. They must shower with soap to get relief and need help stripping off their fuel-soaked clothes. But just touching their clothing can make latex gloves melt. Okay, we'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Khaled. That wasn't easy. Okay, so thank you everyone for being here. I thought we would do things a little bit differently. I spoke to the panelists ahead of time, and we thought we would, I would pose some sort of common elements or themes that I see, and then invite them to have a conversation with one another, and then, of course, open that up to the audience. So we're going to do it that way. Yeah? Great. Okay. First, thank you, everyone. I'm actually trying to juggle the microphone and look at my notes at the same time. Okay, so one of the things, actually, first of all, I want to thank each and every one of you for quite a remarkable, for me, reading experience and thinking experience, and it's very different to hear you up here, and hopefully we'll have you engage with one another. So one of the things I was really struck by in each of your presentations is the presence of the sea itself. It is a character, it is an accomplice of sorts, it's a conveyor of misery and ideas, and I'm so interested in having you each engage with that idea of the sea showing up in, for example, Khaled's poetry, in, of course, crossing West Africa to the Caribbean, and islands versus continents, for example, Aliyah. The other thing I think is so interesting is that a lot of this writing is done in ages of denial. A denial, for example, of the Armenian genocide, a denial of the Muslim character, or actually the inherently free character of the persons about whom you write, Aliyah. The denial of, to put it very simply, of people's humanities and stories, and dimension that you, Khaled, are so interested in inscribing, which brings me to creation survives as inscription. This is something I'm borrowing from you, Karin, thank you so much. And that absence is so much in the act of writing, but that in inscribing, that is where survival can happen. So I think that's so interesting for each and every one of you. Of course, there is empire everywhere. There's the Ottoman Empire and what happens with the fall of it. There is, of course, the Roman Empire. There's the British Empire. So I'm very interested in seeing, in understanding how each of you kind of engage in that kind of meaningfully. And also what's fascinating to me also is the religiously infused language in each and every one of your pieces. So we have Psalms, we have, I did not know that blessing was the name of a person, but of course there's a wonderful play on that word. There's the manual of how to practice Islam, for example. There's this wonderful, that harkens back to an earlier presentation about hiding through conversion, right? I can't remember who it was earlier who said there is this adoption of Christianity to survive. Reminds me of the characters that you write about, Aliyah, in your papers. Of course, there's Beledian's theological connotations. So I've presented a lot, and I kind of would like to go quiet. Yeah, sorry, I know you're trying to take notes, Aliyah. And I would love to invite a conversation, elaboration amongst the three of you. And thank you.
Where to start?
I know.
Yeah.
All right.
Let's talk about the sea.
Okay.
Great.
We have to
You
talk
might need
about
to
this.
speak into your, would you speak into your?
Microphone.
Yeah, thank you, Aliyah.
Yeah, they're all on.
They're on?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. You can turn them on now.
Speak louder, that's okay. Great. Awesome, thank you.
Okay. What are we going to say about? What are we going to say about the sea?
Well, your entire book is about the sea.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know what to say exactly, except just the expectation of rescue on these, the way things have gone about in this business is that it every step of rescue perhaps added an element of danger. So the Italians began. In the island of Lampedusa, there's called a boat cemetery. So to prohibit the trafficking, they take the boats and they break them apart, and you can go to this boat cemetery, and you could see these basically destroyed boats. There's so many cassettes in them of all kinds of people living. I don't know why people brought cassettes with them on these boats. You would see shoes, cans of harissa, sort of like amazing sort of the what people had brought on them on these boats. So the Italians take these boats and keep them on the island. So that was one. And then you got into these dinghies, which is these big rubber boats. And so people got on them. And then once the rescue operations got closer and closer, the dinghies got flimsier and flimsier because they know that they don't have to take all the way to Lampedusa, which is maybe about I'm not sure the distance, maybe 500 kilometers on the sea. So now if you only have to go 20 miles, so the boats got flimsier and flimsier. And so when they say that the sea got more dangerous, the more help came in, the sea got more dangerous. And the more flimsy the boats got, there was pirating in the sea itself. And of course, once the rescue operations came in, then those who were supposed to stop the flow also became businessmen, became traffickers as well. So the Coast Guard, the Libyan Coast Guard, also some of them got involved in, and what the Italians did at one point, they actually paid one town to stop trafficking. And when that town got the money, all the other towns, traffickers from the other, attacked that town and got the money from them, and then the traffic started on again. So in a way, I don't know if that says anything about the sea, but there is in which there's a certain kind of process or a wave of human agency that keeps sort of trying to shortcut the process, whether it's by bribery or by rescue and so on. And of course, the closer the rescue operations got to the Libyan coast, the more volunteers were involved, the more money Europe was putting into the rescue operation, the more the Irish Navy, bless their heart, had sent 2 ships as part of that. Their 2 ships were Joyce and Beckett. I'm not kidding. So it was, the more people got involved with the sea, the more, ironic the situation got, because the rescue, the spending, the money, and there's a kind of a loss of where the central question is. Even the title I tried to say maybe we can reclaim that this is from the Romans, to say this is our sea, that we, the ones on the southern shore. But it's also, there's a comedy about the Italian Navy saying that the Mediterranean Sea is their sea. It's the Sixth Fleet Sea, okay? So it's the American Sea, not the Italians. So there is it's almost like the sea is there to. There's an Arabic song, why is the sea laughing? And so in a way, it's almost like the sea is a cruel creature, but it's also, it's almost like the cruelty of the sea is to bring us back to our senses, which is to ask T.S. Eliot maybe, the essential question that you're avoiding, the overwhelming question that is like, are these, the humanity, is there any way for this wealth and power and agency to be thought of in a different way, and the sea is like sloshing away our foolishness.
I mean, the way you describe the sea is slashing, slashing, and going through its own actions, regardless of what humanity does, makes me wonder. Like, is the sea a neutral agent here, upon which human actions happen? It's like the sea is this migration metaphor that never stops giving, right? Like, it's certainly true in like Caribbean studies. I mean, for the Kaaba, the author that I talk about, the first one that I spoke about, it is, physical sea crossing from West Africa to the Caribbean. It is also metaphoric in like 15 different ways, including, as a specific Sufi theological concept, right? It's the sea of love, it's the sea of knowledge. But actually, can I ask my panelists 2 specific questions, my fellow panelists here, that I was thinking about as we were doing this? And one of them, Khaled, the one I was thinking about Rima's question of the way that all of our work is somewhat religiously infused. That line that you said, where even God can't find me here, reminded me of the line from, or a couple of the lines from Kaaba's autobiography, where he is talking about like, religion and God can't find him. Well, while he is enslaved, he can't find it, and it can't find him. I don't know. So I have some kind of question embedded there about what it means that God cannot find you. And then I'll ask the other question of Karen now too. I was interested in your characterization of these figures, these 3 poets' figures, as negativity, like what they were doing as negativity. I was like, are you sure? Like, what do you mean by like negativity? Like, what are you characterizing as negativity? And then you like pulled inside, you invoked Saidiya Hartman and critical fabulation, which is like the hot thing in literature. I say this as a literature professor. But I wonder if I wanted to actually know if negativity for you, since we're talking about like archival absence and loss, like if it means like archival absence, or it actually just means loss. Like what exactly? And then a related question to the sea thing, since apparently I just have all these questions, is what is maybe you didn't say, you have not spoken about the sea, but like of what importance is the sea to Armenian literature when the question is one of a homeland?
Go ahead.
I should go. Okay. Well, let me start with the last question. With the sea, I mean, hopefully you remember the first
closer to
part that I read,
Yeah.
the Sarafian poet that I started, which is explicitly nautical, so to speak. And the whole volume, Reflux and Flux, with the title, everything is about the sea, one can say, about that volume. And it's, so to my knowledge, it's a very rare piece in Armenian literature, because Armenian literature precisely is about mountains and land. But that's why it's very interesting, because here we have soon after the catastrophe, we have poets, and they are in the minority, who are trying to rethink the whole thing, so to speak. We're really trying to approach and create with this experience of post-catastrophic dispersion, basically. And the sea, I didn't read that part, but and the fact that Sarafian was born on the Black Sea, so to speak, that's the story kind of that goes. But also, of course, the people who committed the genocide, they would throw Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians into the Black Sea. And so the Black Sea was, but also one more layer to the sea figure, the sea was also the means and a place through which they were rescued, some of them, right? So there are all these layers about the sea, and it's really fascinating that Sarafian was able to sort of like construct a whole figurative landscape with the sea sort of at its heart.
And some of them end up in Beirut, a city by the sea.
Yes,
Thought about.
of course. Yes. I mean, I can speak about the negativity, but I can.
Go ahead. No way.
All right. Well, it's a good question. I also was like, do I want to really choose this term? The term is one thing. The definition, or what I try to do with it, is another thing, of course. But I'm still happy. It's good that people are asking questions about it. But for me, it's of course it's loss, but it's also the figuration of loss, the presence of the absence, so to speak, the way the absence is revealing itself as an absence. And I feel that's kind of like a claim that I want to develop further, is that migration oftentimes bears that experience. And just to talk about migration in terms of history, sort of like in a conventional way, or statistics, of course it bears the kind of the promise to reach you know, to that kind of truth about the migrant, but there is that truth that's absent, basically. And that leads me, if I can ask you a couple of questions. I was fascinated by your introduction. You said a book of voices in the making, and then you described peoples who are basically went up in the sea and they die and there are no graves for them and it's a catastrophe. And so you're basically from my kind of jargon, you are inscribing the negative in a sense. Your poems are approaching this loss. That's how I kind of thought about them. And that's how
I haven't really thought about how many of the voices survived and how many did not. But I mean, there is this Walcott, who's a ghost in my book, talks about the sea's history, where it's almost like all laid out down there. I mean, I think it's the dead who show up on the shores in Libya often are the great sort of absence in some ways, because the discussion is always about the numbers of those who survive. When the pictures are like hundreds of hands reaching out, it's almost like there's plenty of living to those who are, Europe. There's a sense of like people are reaching out towards us. But in fact, it is about loss and absence and loss of time. I mean, by the time you get to the sea, it's often years, and then you cross the sea, and for your status to be clarified, it is another 10 to 20 years. So maybe there's also an account of time, an account of lost lost time.
Yeah.
I forgot your question, Aliyah, to me.
I think if you'll excuse me, speaking of time, I'm going to open up.
Okay, sure, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, we haven't come to-
but just a last comment on what you were saying, Khaled. Beledian's writing rescues the death of the dead. I think that's the kind of work that you are engaging in your own writing, may I presume. But I'd like to open it up to questions. Thank you for being so patient.
Thank you so much for this powerful presentation, and I missed most of it because I was teaching, so I am unfortunate.
That's what you get for teaching.
So I was running to catch this wonderful panel. I have a question for you, Khaled, about this collection poems. So your poems are so compelling and so profound. But my question is, I feel like the cover of the cover of your collection poems, so it means you are not working to refresh the memory, the historical memory, because it's our sea. So this is the term that you used it. But I feel like through this ship, it means try to refresh our memory for the new slavery system. Because I remember this ship, because use the same crowded people with their like a black color. And also you mentioned the sea became their cemetery. So looks like it's like a grave. It's a black, dark grave inside this like blue, holy color. It's kind of. So my question is, so who's your audience in this? It means the Arab audience, Western audience, because I feel through your reading, it means you have like very deep meaning, hidden deep meaning. It's almost criticizing the political system. So who's your audience? And the other question, if you allow me to do, so it means, did you use the sea as a poetic mask? Did you use the title of your collection poems as a poetic mask too? It means to say our sea, it means this is not our area, so that's why we are refugee. So this is not our sea either. So this is not our, so what you would like to mention?
I'll try. There are a lot of questions in here. The work of the art cover is actually by a Tunisian artist, Slim Fejari, who actually crossed the sea from Tunisia, and the work was from a book of art. The Edizioni. I'm forgetting the publisher's name. So it is actually a small publishing house in Rome, Edizioni Else. They specialize in promoting the visual arts of migrants. So this is his depiction. But of course, the middle passage is a point of reference for me. And I mean, I actually refer to Robert Hayden's poem, The Middle Passage, as particularly, and there's a poem dedicated to Robert Hayden's depiction. For me, this is a new reading. It is not slavery per se, but there is enslavement on the way. And if you read what's happening to the migrants as they stay in camps and so on, there is a diminution of humanity. I mean, a lot of the young women who are in the prostitution, they are in forced labor. I don't know if you can call that slavery or not. But there's a diminution of humanity at all levels. One of the with the earlier paper about Cambodian refugees, somebody was saying, well, we were made into children here. It's actually some of the refugees in Spain, was there, once you're in the refugee camp, you're not supposed to leave, but there is no work, there is no income. And he said, you're treating us like babies. You're like feeding us and clothing us in the same sort of uniform, but making sure that we do not go anywhere. Mm-hmm. So that's different, but definitely the middle passage is. I don't have a poem in the voice of the sea. I really try to keep, and again, voices, to some degree there might be disembodied voices. I really tried not to have this become a documentary poetics project. I wanted it to take the route of more the psalm, more the sort of the plea, the worship, and the sense of the psalm. One of the best definitions of God is like you're on a boat actually, and you're on your own on the sea, and who do you cry out? Mm-hmm. Whoever you cry out to is God. Mm-hmm. So God is the ultimate absence / presence.
Yes.
So that's where the voices are at that cusp of non-being, if you will. I'm trying to sound philosophical.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Other questions?
I wanted to sort of like echo this and ask a question to Aliyah, if that's possible. Yeah. So you said in your paper that, and maybe I should just read the book and to understand what's going on. But and everyone should read Aliyah's book.
Yeah,
thank you.
You're welcome.
Good marketing.
It is.
Yes,
Wonderful.
Absolutely.
So you said that you're trying to establish an Islamic literary genealogy in the Caribbean space, and it seems that one point that I understood is that there are some post-colonial stakes in that.
Sure.
I wonder what work do you want to do with that kind of genealogy?
Mm-hmm. That is a complicated question. I'm glad you brought up the post-colonial. Yes, it is. So this acts in some way to a counter to the irreligiosity of post-colonial literature, right? Which has to some extent some roots in, Marxism, and other and like really Enlightenment literature, right? In which there is no space for the divine, or there is no, or it's at least subsumed, or it's buried in some kind of way as a substrate. So yes, that is exactly what I'm trying to do, is to think about how it is that religion manifests in post-colonial literature and in colonial literature too, because it is the way that people live their lives. It is lived life, right? You cannot study the literatures of the global South, or you can't think about the people of the global South without acknowledging their religiosity. At least I don't think so. And I mean, it is a great lack in post-colonial literature, or at least post-colonial literature in the conventional sense, like the lack of acknowledgement.
And migration, the stories of these mitigated, very long migrations speak of like tuqya, the process of changing faith or life story. I mean, the tuqya becomes like where, I mean, it's almost like filling an EU refugee form requires that you do tuqya. You have to say whether you are, you know, what the certain kind of suffering that you have. Some people are, you know, they said, I'm an atheist. I'm an Arab stan atheist. So because they know that that's the application.
Yeah, you have to disavow
They
it.
have to, and then also, you know, that there are people, the applicants are seeking queer or gay folks.
Yeah.
So that becomes, so there's all sorts of, you know, shaping that goes in the process of acceptance, and also the experience. I mean, so once you have nothing, I mean, there is also a sense of beginning, a sense of starting over. Your life is, people change their names, take up different names, take up religions temporarily. So there is a strange, compulsive readaptation, but also perhaps a compelled sense of freedom, that you are freeing, you're forced into freedom that you may have not wanted, which means that you now have to have a certain name or a certain identity or a certain history. So you can adopt different identities and different faiths. But what I'm saying is that the tuqya is now this sort of widened because of the parameters of what people are going through.
Yeah, you have to. You're describing like you have to frame yourself as a secular subject, or a desirous secular subject,
Exactly,
one who
yeah.
wishes to be a secular subject, but is has been prevented in their native land from doing so.
Yeah. I mean, or if you were like I don't know, if you were a Yazidi and maybe not so
Right.
much of a Yazidi, then you have to inscribe yourself as a very much there are certain transformations that the politics are imposing on people, and I'm sure that's some of the calculus going on with the figure that you whose name I'm forgotten that you talked about.
Yeah, great, thank you. I think we may have time for one more question.
I could make one comment about the religion question.
Yeah.
Only about questions come first. So priorities.
No, I'm glad you're excited, Karen. Is there a question from the audience?
No, they want to go.
It's all yours, Karen.
All right, 30 seconds. I think it's not accidental that there's in the mantras, you know, Bulugan is dealing with the faith, theology, blah, 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 because precisely he's engaging with the European, but also the Armenian Christian tradition, but he's not in that tradition.
Yeah.
So he's trying to sort of like find his distances away from that tradition by sort of like bringing in other discursive elements, other things. So, and again, there's that, again, secularization, sort of like deadening, materialistic, positivistic secularization. Yeah.
No, there is the hosts of migrants are there is it's a mirror, and they're sort of, it's a mirror, and you're trying to see what they want you to look at. They want to look like. They're not giving you an image of yourself. They're giving you it's like a hole in a fair. It looks like a bear or something, and you put your head through it. You're going to have to look like something else, and so you try to suit that. It's not a difficult. It takes lives to figure out how the real person are, and where is the true self beyond the management of multiple hypocrisies. That's decades of living and thinking. So,
Thank you so much, everyone. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for this very engaging conversation.